The entire boardroom went dead silent the moment Tess pointed at my hand and laughed. She called my ring-rusted trash right in front of the billionaire investor we were trying to impress. She thought she was humiliating a low-level data analyst to show off her dominance. She had no idea that the trash on my finger wasn't jewelry at all. It was the founder's iron seal, a physical key with more voting power than her father's entire stock portfolio. She didn't just ruin the meeting, she accidentally authorized her own firing. Before I tell you how a single piece of iron dismantled a corrupt dynasty, let me know in the comments. Has a coworker ever mocked you for being too quiet? And if you want to see arrogance get crushed by cold hard logic, hit that subscribe button. You're gonna love this audit. My name is Mara Kovic, and for the last 12 years, I have served as the Senior Data Controller for Aurum Holdings, a role that effectively renders me the invisible spine of a corporation that prides itself on its flashy, glass-walled exterior. I am 38 years old, a woman of patience and precision in an industry that rewards volume and velocity, and I have spent over a decade silently observing the slow, corrosive decay of competence from the corner of the room. In the grand ecosystem of this Manhattan financial fortress, I am not the lion or the shark. I am the architect who knows exactly which load-bearing pillars have been hollowed out by termites, and I have watched, file by file, as the people in charge began to mistake the stability I provide for their own invincibility. I do not engage in the frantic social climbing that characterizes the junior executive tier, nor do I participate in the hollow camaraderie of mandatory happy hours. I simply do the work that keeps the lights on, a fact that makes me dangerous in a way that people like Julian Vanier are too arrogant to understand. The boardroom was colder than usual that Tuesday morning, a deliberate tactic used by the facilities team to keep everyone alert, but the chill in the air had nothing to do with the thermostat. We were gathered in the main executive conference suite, a room designed to intimidate, with floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the skyline and a mahogany table long enough to land a small aircraft on. Sitting directly across from me was the primary source of the room's tension, Tess Vanier. At 26, Tess held the title of Creative Director, a position that had been conspicuously created 6 months prior, coincidentally 1 week after she had failed to launch her own fashion startup. She was the daughter of Julian Vanier, the vice president of strategy, and she occupied space with the reckless, unearned confidence of someone whose safety net is woven from other people's salaries. She was scrolling through her phone, ignoring the preparatory briefing, her wrists adorned with a chaotic stack of gold bracelets that clattered against the expensive wood every time she moved, creating a soundtrack of metallic irritation that set everyone's teeth on edge. The stakes for this meeting could not have been higher, and the smell of fear in the room was almost thick enough to taste. We were awaiting the arrival of Harlan Gentry, a billionaire investor from the old guard of American finance, a man whose approval could stabilize our plummeting stock price and whose rejection would almost certainly trigger a liquidity crisis. The room was populated by 14 of the firm's top minds, senior analysts, legal counsel, and strategy directors, all of them sweating through their starch-stiffened collars, checking their watches, and frantically rehearsing their lines. I sat at the far end of the table, the designated data person, present only to answer technical questions if asked, and otherwise expected to blend into the drywall. My hands were folded neatly on top of a stack of compliance reports, my posture straight, my expression neutral. It was a posture of defense, a habit learned from years of navigating a workplace where being noticed usually meant being blamed for someone else's mistake. It was during a lull in the conversation, while the team nervously rechecked the slide deck for the 10th time, that Tess decided she was bored. Her eyes, heavily lined and tired from a night she had undoubtedly documented on social media, drifted across the table and landed on my left hand. Specifically, they landed on the ring I wore on my 4th finger. It was not a delicate piece, nor was it designed to catch the light. It was a thick, heavy band of dark, pitted iron, dull and unpolished, with a flat, hexagonal face etched with a symbol that had been worn down by 70 years of friction. It was an object of utility, not vanity, and in the gleaming, sanitized aesthetic of the boardroom, it stood out like a bruise. To me, it was a reminder of the strength required to build something lasting. To her, it was simply an offense to her carefully curated aesthetic. Tess let out a sharp, incredulous laugh that shattered the quiet hum of the room. She didn't whisper to her neighbor. She projected her voice, treating the conference room like her personal stage. She pointed a manicured finger, capped with a long, sharp acrylic nail, directly at my hand. She asked, with a tone of mock bewilderment that she probably thought was charming, if I had been digging in the garden before coming to work, or if I had perhaps found that thing in a drain pipe on my way to the office. The room went instantly silent. The nervous shuffling of papers stopped. The quiet conversations died. 14 pairs of eyes shifted from the presentation screen to me, a collective inhale of breath as everyone waited to see how the quiet data controller would handle the vice president's daughter. It was the kind of silence that usually precedes a public execution. I did not pull my hand away. I did not cover the ring with my other hand, nor did I flush with the shame she was trying to elicit. I simply turned the iron band slowly on my finger, feeling the cold, rough texture of the metal against my skin, a tactile anchor in a sea of superficiality. I looked at her calmly, my face a mask of professional detachment, and said nothing. The silence clearly agitated her. To Tess, silence was a vacuum that needed to be filled with noise. She leaned forward, her bracelets clattering loudly, and continued her assault. She called the ring thrift store chic and medieval peasant wear, laughing at her own wit. She looked around the table, her eyes gleaming, inviting the others to join in the joke, to validate her dominance by punching down. "Seriously, Mara," she sneered, her voice echoing off the glass walls. "We are meeting with a billionaire. You look like you're wearing a lug nut. It's embarrassing." Julian Vanier, her father, barely looked up from his notes. He was a man who had spent the last 5 years stripping the copper wiring out of the company's walls to sell for scraps, hiding the structural damage under layers of complex accounting that only I had bothered to untangle. He cleared his throat, not to reprimand his daughter for her cruelty, but to pile on. He sighed, the sound of a man burdened by the incompetence of his inferiors, and told me that appearances mattered. He said that Harlan Gentry was a man of refined taste, a traditionalist, and that we could not afford to have anything distasteful or eccentric at the table. He ordered me framed as a suggestion, but delivered as a command to put the ring in my pocket or, better yet, leave the room until the meeting was concluded. I looked at Julian. I looked at the sweat beading on his upper lip, the slight tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by gripping his pen too tightly. He was terrified. He knew the financials were weak, and he was projecting that fear onto the easiest target in the room. I slowly closed the file in front of me. I did not argue. I did not raise my voice to defend the sentimental value of the object. I simply nodded, acknowledging the receipt of his instruction, without accepting the validity of his judgment. I told him, in a voice that was soft but carried the weight of absolute certainty, that I would remain. I added, almost as an afterthought, that gold is for show, but iron is for structure. He rolled his eyes, dismissing me as a bitter, low-level employee trying to sound profound, and turned back to his slides, muttering about how hard it was to find good help these days. 10 minutes later, the double mahogany doors opened, and the atmosphere in the room shifted from anxiety to terror. Harlan Gentry walked in. He was 70 years old, a man who moved with the slow, crushing inevitability of a glacier. He was wearing a charcoal suit that was clearly tailored decades ago, the fabric heavy and matte, absorbing the light rather than reflecting it. He did not smile. He did not offer performative handshakes. He walked past the line of executives who had stood up to greet him, ignoring their outstretched hands and their rehearsed pleasantries, and stood at the foot of the table. He was a man who had seen markets crash and empires burn, and he had no patience for the theater of modern business. He looked at the room not as a potential partner, but as an auditor inspecting a crumbling building. Tess, unable to read the room, immediately launched into her pitch. She flashed a bright, practiced smile and began to recite her rehearsed speech about synergy and visual disruptors. She used every buzzword in the dictionary, her hands waving frantically, her jewelry catching the light of the projector and sending fractured rainbows dancing across the serious, stone-faced expressions of Harlan's legal team. She was performing, desperate for approval, desperate to prove that she belonged in this room. But Harlan wasn't looking at her. He wasn't looking at the revenue projections on the screen. He wasn't looking at the expensive catering that had gone untouched. He was looking at my hand. He stopped dead in the center of the room, turning his back on Julian, who was midway through a sentence about Q4 deliverables. The silence that fell over the room was instant and terrifying. Harlan took 2 steps toward me. He didn't look at my face. His eyes were locked on the dark iron band on my finger. He squinted, his breath catching in his throat. a sound that was audible in the sudden quiet. He reached out a trembling hand, hovering inches above the metal, as if he were afraid it might burn him. "The iron seal," he whispered, his voice sounding like gravel grinding against steel. "I haven't seen that since the day the charter was signed in the basement of the Federal Reserve." He looked up at me then, his eyes searching my face with an intensity that made the air feel thin. He didn't ask who I was. He asked where I got it. I met his gaze, keeping my expression neutral. I told him it was a gift. I told him it was given to me by the man who laid the first brick of this building. The man who wrote the original charter in a notebook that no one reads anymore. I told him the ring was not jewelry. It was a seal. The color drained from Julian's face. He looked like he was about to faint. Tess, however, looked confused. Her smile faltered, but her arrogance remained. She tried to laugh it off, stepping between us, blocking Harlan's view of me. She told Harlan that it was just a cheap trinket, that she had already told me to throw it away. She apologized for the eyesore, assuming that Harlan was offended by its ugliness. She thought she was saving the moment. She had no idea she was digging her own grave. Harlan spun around and looked at her with a disgust so profound it felt physical. He told her to be silent. He said that the trinket she was mocking was forged from the first steel beam of this tower. He said it represented the authority of the original ownership, the promise of integrity that built this firm. He looked at Julian and said, quite simply, that he could not do business with a firm that did not recognize its own foundation. He said a company that treats its history like trash is a company destined for bankruptcy. He closed his portfolio with a snap that sounded like a gunshot. He didn't scream. He didn't make a scene. He just stated a fact. The deal was dead. He walked out of the room, leaving $800 million of potential capital evaporating in the hallway. The explosion happened 3 seconds after the door clicked shut. Julian turned on me with the fury of a cornered animal. The fear of financial ruin had stripped away his veneer of corporate politeness. He slammed his fist on the table and screamed that I had sabotaged the meeting. He accused me of conspiring with the client to humiliate him. Tess joined in, her voice shrill and panicked, blaming me for ruining her presentation with my garbage ring. They were terrified, and like all weak leaders, they needed a scapegoat immediately. Julian pointed at the door and told me I was suspended. He ordered me to leave the building immediately before he called the police and had me charged with corporate espionage. I stood up slowly. I gathered my files. I placed my plastic ID badge gently on the mahogany table. I didn't argue. I didn't try to explain that their incompetence was the cause of this disaster, not my ring. I walked out of the boardroom, past the staring eyes of the junior analysts, who were too afraid to speak. I walked down the hallway to the elevator bank. I did not press the button for the lobby. I took a small, silver key from my pocket, a key that I had carried for 12 years, passed down to me by my predecessor, and inserted it into the maintenance panel of the service elevator. I turned it to the right. A button that wasn't lit up before marked B4 flickered to life. I pressed it. The elevator didn't chime. It just descended with a heavy mechanical hum, taking me down past the parking garage, past the sewer lines, down to the bedrock of Manhattan. Sublevel 4 was the archives, a place that existed outside of time. It was a climate-controlled bunker that smelled of old paper, dust, and ozone. Sitting at a steel desk by the heavy blast door was Mr. Abernathy, the 80-year-old archivist who had been waiting for this day for a decade. He stood up when he saw me, his eyes landing on the ring. He didn't say a word. He just nodded and unlocked the heavy steel gate. Inside the vault, the air was still. In the center of the room stood the master terminal. Not a sleek, modern computer, but a heavy, standalone mainframe that was physically disconnected from the internet. It was the dead man's switch of the corporation. On the console, there was no fingerprint scanner, no password prompt. There was only a hexagonal indentation in the steel plate. I placed my hand on the console. I pressed the iron seal into the slot. It fit perfectly. I turned my fist 90 degrees. A heavy clunk echoed through the room as the internal tumblers disengaged. The screen flickered to life, glowing with amber text, "Access granted, starting full audit." Upstairs, on the 40th floor, the chaos was about to turn into a catastrophe. Julian was sitting at his computer, trying to delete my personnel file, trying to erase me from existence. Suddenly, his screen froze. A black window popped up with a single line of text. "System locked." He tried to close it. He couldn't. Across the office, every printer, dozens of them, woke up simultaneously. They began to whir and churn. They weren't printing gibberish. They were printing the variance report. The system in the basement was comparing the authorized budget in the original ledger against the actual spending in Julian's department. Every discrepancy, every fake invoice, every dollar siphoned into an offshore account was being identified as an anomaly and printed out in hard copy. Tess screamed from her office. Her corporate credit card had just been declined at the coffee shop downstairs. Her email access was revoked. The digital walls were closing in. I sat in the basement, watching the progress bar on the old screen. The audit was ruthless and mathematical. It didn't care about excuses or job titles. It only cared about the truth. I picked up the red phone on the desk, the direct line to the board of directors. It began to ring almost immediately. I let it ring twice before answering. "Archives," I said, my voice calm, echoing slightly in the concrete room. "This is Mara Kovic. I believe you're looking for the missing $800 million. I haven't lost it. I'm just making sure the people who stole it pay it back." The elevator ride back up from the subterranean archives felt fundamentally different than the descent had only 20 minutes prior. When I had traveled down, I was a suspended employee, a woman stripped of her credentials and cast out by a system that valued nepotism over competence, carrying the heavy weight of humiliation and the uncertain burden of a promise made to a dead man. But as the gears hummed and lifted me toward the 42nd floor, feeling the slight, rhythmic pressure of gravity against my knees, I realized that I had undergone a transformation in the darkness of the basement. I was no longer just Mara Kovic, the invisible data controller who ate lunch at her desk and never spoke in meetings. I had become the proxy for a 70-year-old correction mechanism, the human embodiment of the Iron Seal, scrubbing in to perform emergency surgery on a dying patient. I stood alone in the brushed metal box, watching the floor numbers climb on the digital display, checking my reflection in the steel doors not out of vanity, but out of a need to ensure my armor was intact. I smoothed the lapels of my navy blazer. I did not feel the hot flush of adrenaline or the giddy rush of impending victory. I felt cold, clinical, and possessed by the heavy, exhausting sense of duty that comes when you are the only adult left in a room full of children who have broken something irreplaceable. The red phone in the basement had confirmed that the board of directors had assembled, summoned by the automated alarms triggered by the audit, and while they were waiting for Julian to explain himself, they were about to get me. When the elevator doors slid open on the executive floor, the sound hit me first, a physical wall of noise that made me pause in the vestibule. This corridor was usually a sanctuary of hushed tones, soft footsteps on plush carpet, and the polite, muffled murmur of high-level commerce, designed to sound like old money, quiet, assured, and private. Today, however, it sounded like a factory floor in the middle of a catastrophic malfunction. The mechanical whirring of 36 industrial printers working in unison created a deafening drone, a relentless, rhythmic chug-chug-chug of paper moving through rollers at high speed, layering the air with the smell of hot toner and static electricity. I stepped out into the hallway and stopped, taking in the scene with the detached eye of an auditor. The floor, usually pristine and vacuumed in straight lines, was covered in white, looking as though a blizzard had struck the interior of the skyscraper. Thousands of sheets of paper lay scattered across the carpet, draped over cubicle walls, and spilling out of output trays like water from an overflowing dam, creating drifts of evidence against the baseboards. Staff members, junior analysts, executive assistants, and interns were standing in clusters, holding sheets of paper, their faces pale, reading the secrets that had been hidden in encrypted folders just an hour ago. I walked through the storm of paper, my heels sinking into the layers of documents, the sound of crumping paper following my footsteps. I did not stop to pick them up. I knew exactly what they said. Every sheet was a testament to Julian Vanier's arrogance, a paper trail of a man who thought he was invisible. As I walked, I glanced down and saw a flight log for the corporate jet, documenting a trip to a private island in the Caribbean during a week when the company was supposedly in a blackout period for travel due to budget cuts. Next to it lay an invoice for consulting services paid to a shell company with an address that matched a P.O. box in a tax haven known for hiding assets. Further down, I saw receipts for Tess's wardrobe, categorized under branding assets and visual identity development, totaling more than the annual salary of the assistants currently reading them. The secrets were out. The digital walls had fallen. and the physical truth was burying the office in a landslide of facts. The employees parted as I walked down the main corridor, looking at me with a mixture of confusion and awe. They saw the heavy iron ring on my hand, the same ring Tess had mocked earlier, but they no longer saw a piece of scrap metal. They saw the key that had unlocked the truth. I didn't speak to them. I didn't smile. And I didn't slow down. I walked straight to the double mahogany doors of the boardroom, placed my hand on the cold brass handle, and pushed them open. The scene inside the boardroom was a tableau of absolute panic, a stark contrast to the controlled arrogance that had filled the room earlier that morning. Julian Veneer was standing at the head of the table, his face a mottled patchwork of red and white, sweat dripping visibly from his chin onto his silk tie, his perfectly coiffed hair now disheveled. He was shouting at the chairman of the board, a gray-haired man named Arthur Sterling, who sat with his arms crossed, his expression unreadable but hardening by the second. Tess was sitting in the corner, slumped in a chair, no longer scrolling on her phone. She was weeping, not the soft, sympathetic cry of genuine sorrow, but the jagged, gasping sobs of a spoiled child who has been told for the first time in her life that the party is over. When I entered, the room fell silent. The shouting stopped, the sobbing quieted to a whimper. Julian spun around, his eyes wild and bloodshot. He pointed a shaking finger at me, desperation rolling off him in waves. He shouted that I was the hacker, telling the board that I had planted a virus in the system, that I was a disgruntled employee seeking revenge for the morning's meeting, and that I was fabricating evidence to destroy his reputation. He screamed that I was a criminal, a saboteur, a liar who was trying to bring down the company from the inside. I did not raise my voice, and I did not interrupt him. I walked calmly to the opposite end of the table, the heavy, leather-bound ledger I had brought from the archives tucked under my arm like a judge's gavel. I placed the book onto the polished wood with a heavy thud that echoed in the silence, the sound of history landing on the present. Julian continued to rant, his voice cracking, his accusations becoming more incoherent as he realized no one was stopping me. He claimed that the ring was a stolen key, that I had broken into a secure facility, that I was working for a competitor to tank the stock price. He was throwing every accusation he could think of against the wall, hoping something, anything, would stick. He looked at the board members, pleading with them to call the police, to have me dragged out in handcuffs. He was a man drowning, trying to climb on top of anyone he could to keep his head above water, even if it meant dragging the whole company down with him. When he finally ran out of breath, panting and gripping the edge of the table for support, I looked at Arthur Sterling. The chairman looked at me, then at the ledger, and finally at the iron ring on my hand. He asked, in a voice that was barely a whisper, if the audit was accurate. I didn't look at Julian. I opened the ledger to the very first page, where the ink was faded and brown, signed by the founding partners in 1954. I told him that the audit was not generated by me. I explained that it was a mathematical reconciliation between the original charter's definition of legitimate business expense and the current spending of the executive suite. I told him that math does not have an agenda. Math does not hold grudges. Math simply balances the equation. And right now, the equation was off by $40 million. Julian lunged toward the table, slamming his hands down, his face contorted with rage. He screamed that $40 million was a rounding error in a company of this size, that it was standard operating procedure, that he had made the company 10 times that amount in strategy deals. He tried to minimize the theft, to frame it as the cost of doing business, as if embezzlement was just a perk of the job. I turned to look at him, meeting his gaze for the first time since I entered the room. I spoke softly, but my voice carried to every corner of the room, cutting through his hysteria. I told him that he hadn't made the company money. I told him that according to the data I had just released, he had been leveraging the company's pension fund to cover the losses of his failed strategy deals for 5 years. I told him that he wasn't a strategist. He was a gambler who had been doubling down with other people's money, specifically the retirement savings of the people answering his phones, and his luck had finally run out. Tess stood up then, wiping her eyes, her mascara smeared across her cheeks in dark streaks. She tried to muster the same arrogance she had shown earlier that morning, but it was brittle now, fragile as glass. She asked, "Who gave me the right to do this?" She pointed at the ring again, her voice shrill and shaking, asking why a piece of garbage gave me the power to ruin her father's life. She still didn't understand. She looked at the board, expecting them to defend her, to defend the class structure that she believed protected her from people like me. She demanded that they fire me again. She demanded that security remove me and my fake books. She stamped her foot like a toddler, unable to comprehend a world where her last name didn't buy her immunity. Arthur Sterling stood up slowly. He did not look at Tess. He looked at the legal counsel sitting to his right, a sharp woman named Eleanor, who had been frantically reading through the company charter on her tablet since the printers started. He asked a single, clarifying question. Does the Iron Seal Protocol still hold legal standing in the bylaws? Eleanor nodded slowly, her face pale. She confirmed that the protocol was never repealed. She explained that the bearer of the seal has the authority of a founding partner during times of financial distress or ethical breach. She looked at Julian, then at me. She said that legally, as of the moment the ring was inserted into the terminal in the basement, the current executive team was suspended pending the conclusion of the audit. My authority was absolute. Julian collapsed into his chair. The fight went out of him all at once. He realized that this wasn't a coup, it was a foreclosure. But I wasn't finished. I looked at Tess. I told her that she had mocked the ring because she judged the world by its cover, but she had failed to read the contract inside the book. I told her that she thought she was above the rules because of who her father was, but she didn't realize that the rules were written to protect the company from exactly this kind of entitlement. I told her that by insulting the seal, she hadn't just been rude. She had triggered a specific clause in the corporate charter that dealt with hostile actions against the trust. I turned a page in the ledger and pointed to a paragraph written in dense, archaic legal script. I read it aloud to the room. It was the clawback provision. It stated that in the event of gross negligence, theft, or misappropriation of funds by an executive or their immediate family, the company had the right to recover not just the stolen money, but all compensation, bonuses, and stock options awarded during the period of the breach. I looked at Julian. I told him that the house in the Hamptons, the apartment on Fifth Avenue, the private school tuition, the luxury cars, and the art collection, they didn't belong to him anymore. They belonged to the shareholders. They belonged to the pension fund he had raided. Tess gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at her father, waiting for him to say it wasn't true, that their wealth was untouchable, that the trust funds were safe. But Julian just stared at the table, his hands shaking uncontrollably. He knew the bylaws. He knew what he had signed 20 years ago, never thinking that the Iron Seal would ever surface again. He had forgotten that ghosts can come back if you don't bury them deep enough. I looked at Tess and told her that her corporate credit card had already been canceled, but that was the least of her problems. I told her that the audit had flagged her salary as unjustified nepotism and that she would be required to repay every dollar she had received since the day she was hired or face legal prosecution for wire fraud. Her lifestyle wasn't just over, it was being repossessed. The doors to the boardroom opened again. This time, it wasn't a billionaire investor entering. It was two officers from the New York Police Department, accompanied by the head of building security. They didn't come in with guns drawn. They walked in with quiet, bureaucratic efficiency. The audit in the basement hadn't just alerted the board, it had automatically forwarded the evidence of embezzlement to the district attorney's office via the Securities and Exchange Commission's automated tip line. That was the final function of the dead man's switch. It removed the choice from human hands. It ensured that no deal could be cut, no cover-up could be arranged, no golden parachute could be deployed. The data had been sent. The crime had been reported. The machinery of justice was already grinding into motion. Julian stood up. He didn't protest. He didn't shout. He looked like a man who had suddenly aged 20 years in 20 minutes. He held out his hands, and the officer placed the handcuffs on him. The metallic click was loud in the silent room. It was a different sound than the gold bracelets Tess wore. A sound of finality, of a door closing forever. Tess started to scream then. She grabbed her father's arm, pulling at him, begging the officers to stop. She looked at me, her eyes filled with hate, and screamed that I was a monster. She said I had planned this, that I was jealous, that I was evil. She didn't see her father as a criminal. She saw herself as a victim. I watched them lead Julian out. I watched Tess being escorted by security, still screaming, her heels clicking frantically on the floor as she was removed from the building she thought she owned. I felt no joy. I felt no satisfaction. I only felt the heavy, exhausting weight of necessary work. The room was quiet again. The board members sat in stunned silence, looking at the empty chair where Julian had sat, and then looking at me. They were afraid. They wondered if the audit had found dirt on them too. They wondered if I was going to purge the entire table. They shifted in their seats, adjusting their ties, suddenly aware of how fragile their own positions were. Arthur Sterling cleared his throat. He looked at me with a newfound respect, bordering on fear. He stood up and buttoned his jacket. He walked over to where I was standing. He told me that the company owed me a debt that could not be repaid. He said that with Julian gone, the position of CEO was vacant. He looked around the table, gathering silent nods of agreement from the other members. He offered me the job. He said that I was obviously the only person who understood the true values of the firm. He said that the board would unanimously vote to install me as the new head of Aurum Holdings, with a compensation package that would make me wealthy beyond my imagination. He extended his hand, waiting for me to accept the crown I had just retrieved from the gutter. I looked at his hand. I looked at the terrified faces of the other board members. They wanted me to take the job because they wanted to feel safe. They wanted to believe that if I was one of them, I wouldn't turn the audit on them. They wanted to buy my silence with a title. They wanted to co-opt the threat I represented. I looked down at the iron ring on my finger. It was heavy. It was uncomfortable. It was not meant to be worn forever. It was a tool, like a wrench or a hammer, meant to be used to fix a specific problem and then put away. It was a burden, not a prize. I shook my head slowly. I told Arthur that I did not want the job. I told him that I was a data controller, not a politician. I told him that the company didn't need a new king, it needed a mechanic. I told him that I was appointing the current director of operations, a quiet man named David who had worked in the annex for 15 years, to take over as interim CEO. David was honest. David knew the business. David didn't care about being famous. David ate lunch at his desk and checked the numbers twice. He was the cure for the culture Julian had built. Arthur looked shocked. He asked why I would turn down the power. He asked what I wanted. I closed the ledger with a soft thud. I picked up the iron ring from my finger and placed it on top of the leather book. I told him that I wanted the one thing this company had denied me for 12 years. I wanted to do my job without interference. I told him that I wanted the freedom to ensure the numbers were real. I told him that the audit would continue until every discrepancy was resolved. I told him that my team, the invisible people in the basement and the back offices, would be watching. I left the ring on the table. It sat there, dark and heavy, a silent warning to anyone who sat in that chair in the future. It was a reminder that authority is not ownership, and that trust is a loan, not a gift. I turned and walked toward the door. The board members watched me go, confusion written on their faces. They couldn't understand why someone would hold the keys to the kingdom and then hand them back. They didn't understand that, for people like me, power isn't about sitting in the big chair. Power is knowing that the chair only stands because we tighten the screws. I walked out of the boardroom and back into the hallway. The printers had finally stopped. The silence was returning, but it was a different kind of silence now. It wasn't the silence of fear. It was the silence of a clean slate. The employees were starting to pick up the papers, starting to organize the mess, starting to work. I walked past them, and for the first time in 12 years, they looked at me. They nodded. Some of them smiled. They knew what I had done. I didn't stop to celebrate. I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the lobby. When I stepped out onto the street, the sun was setting, painting the New York skyline in shades of bruised purple and gold. The air was cold and fresh, smelling of exhaust and roasted nuts, the smell of the city. I took a deep breath. I felt lighter. The heavy weight of the iron ring was gone from my finger, but the phantom sensation of it remained. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was a text message from a number I didn't recognize, but I knew who it was. It was Harlan Gentry. The message was short. The capital is back on the table. David is a good choice. Iron holds. I smiled, a small, private smile that no one else saw. I put the phone away and started walking toward the subway entrance. I wasn't going to a gala. I wasn't going to a victory dinner. I wasn't going to give interviews to the press. I was going home to feed my cat and read a book. The drama was over. The villains were gone. The system had reset. And tomorrow, at 7 a.m., I would be back at my desk, invisible again, watching the numbers, ensuring that the foundation held strong, because in a world of gold and glass, someone has to be the iron. True power isn't about being the loudest voice in the room. As Mara proved, silence isn't weakness, it is often the deadliest strategy. While arrogance screams for attention, integrity simply waits for the numbers to align. If you have ever felt invisible at work, or if you have ever silently held a broken system together while others took the credit, remember, you are not alone. Iron outlasts gold, and the truth always balances the ledger in the end. If this story spoke to you, like, comment, and share it with someone who is still finding their own voice.